Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So last week we started covering conformity, and we talked about what conformity is, as well as the two types of conformity. So the difference between informational social influence and normative social influence. So this week we're going to finish up the information on conformity, and we're also going to talk about obedience. And we'll see how obedience is related to conformity and how obedience can be a good thing, as well as also a negative thing. So we'll talk about conformity and obedience this week. Remember that you do have an activity that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m., so make sure that you keep that in mind. And if you have any questions, let me know. Okay, so let's get into lecture. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to finish up the slides on conformity. And so just as a review, remember that informational social influence is when we conform or we change our behavior or our way of thinking to line up with someone else's because we honestly believe that they're right. Maybe they're an expert, or we feel like we don't know what's going on, so we trust someone else more than ourselves. Normative social influence is when we conform because we want to fit in with other people. We might not actually believe that what they're doing is right, but it's important for us to feel like we have a connection to other people, so sometimes we'll do things even if we disagree with them. So picking up with the material from last week, it says the Ash's line judgment studies. So this is a relatively famous experiment done in social psychology. And what they did was they had a line that was the standard line, and then they would show 3 lines on the other side of the paper, and they would just ask you to match which one of these lines on the right side matches the line on the left, which is a very simple task. All they're asking you to do is to judge the length of these lines. So when they give these tasks to people and they do it by themselves, they almost always get it right. If they have people do several trials of this, they'll get the right answer almost every time because it's a relatively simple task. At least it is when you do it by yourself. But when Ash did this study, what he would do is he would bring in a participant and ask them to do this task, but he would also bring in several confederates. Now remember that a confederate is the social psychology term for an individual who is a researcher who is pretending to be a participant. So he would have several people pretending to be participants and one real participant. So he would ask them which one of these lines over here, 1, 2, or 3, matches this line. Obviously the answer is 2, right? That's what looks right. But what they would do is have the confederates give the wrong answer. So if all of the researchers who were pretending to be participants said that the right answer was line 1, then they would look to the true participant to see, will you conform to what everyone else is saying? Everyone else is giving an obviously wrong answer. Will the participant give the wrong answer, or will they not conform and stick with the answer that they believe is right? Remembering that people almost always get this right on their own. And you can see a little bit about how it's set up here. It says that this individual is the true participant, and there are some other individuals sitting here who are confederates that are giving the wrong answer. So imagine how confusing this would be for you if you were part of a study and there were several other people there that you believed were participants, and they all kept giving answers that didn't make sense to you. I mean, obviously that's a confusing situation, and you start to wonder, maybe you're not understanding the directions, maybe they understand the directions better than you, or maybe you start to wonder if the task might actually be a little bit more difficult than you think it would be. So this is kind of a confusing situation for the true participant. So actually what they found is that although people almost always got the right answer when they were by themselves, if all the confederates were giving the wrong answer, the individual who was the true participant often gave the wrong answer as well. They usually agreed with other people even if it was obvious that those other people were wrong. You might ask yourself, why in the world would someone give an obviously wrong answer just because other people give that answer? Well, when they talked to the people later, these are a few of the thoughts that they had. First of all, they don't want to feel peculiar. It feels very strange and uncomfortable to be different from everyone else, to be the only person who gives a particular answer. So we want to feel like, well, if we're wrong, then we're all wrong together, right? If we all give the same answer and we're all wrong, then there's no reason why I should feel different. But if everyone else gets the right answer and I get the wrong answer, I don't want to be the odd man out, right? Also, we don't want to look like a fool, so perhaps there is something about the task that we're not understanding. Perhaps maybe the other individuals know more of what's going on than I do, so people might be afraid of giving a different answer because they're afraid of being wrong. And then finally, we don't want to upset other people. Even if they're strangers, even if they're individuals that we don't think we're ever going to see again, we still care about what they think. And I think this is just part of human nature. We are a social species. We feel like we need other people. Unfortunately, though, this can be a problem sometimes if it leads us to give obviously wrong answers. I do a variation of this study when I teach in-class general psychology classes, where I put up 3 lines on the board that are all obviously the same length. And ahead of time, I plant Confederates. So I email a few students in the class and ask them to say that line B is the longest line. And so then I call on them in class, and so all the Confederates say that line B is the longest line, even though all 3 lines are the same length. You see that a lot of times people will end up conforming. I then have everyone in the class answer, and a lot of people will say that the right answer is B because they think that maybe perhaps they really don't understand the task, or maybe they don't think it's the right answer, but they don't want to stick out, or they don't want to upset the classmates who said that the answer was B. It's very uncomfortable to have to disagree with your classmates. So I have been able to replicate this kind of in an informal classroom setting. So when we're talking about people conforming in the Ashes line study, typically we're talking about public compliance without private acceptance. So if you remember these terms we talked about a little bit last time, public compliance means that you're going along with the group, at least outwardly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with them internally, privately. So these people probably gave the wrong answer out loud, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they thought that was the right answer. With the Ashes line study, you can obviously tell which one is the right answer. So although the people might have purposefully given the wrong answer, they probably didn't truly believe that they were giving the correct answer. They really probably felt like they knew the right answer, but they didn't give it because they didn't want to feel different. They didn't want to feel somehow as separated from the group or to upset someone in the group. Now this is a little bit scary to think that people would go along with other people even if it's obviously wrong. And obviously this is a trivial example. We're talking about a psychology study where it's not exactly a dangerous situation or even a serious situation, but you could see how these results could generalize to other situations in life where perhaps we make bad decisions because we go along with other people even if we know we shouldn't be doing what they're doing. So it's a good reminder to make sure that we truly are doing the right thing here instead of just conforming to other people. So they have done several variations of this original study where they have changed some things. If they gave people the option to write their answers on paper, right, so they're writing them down instead of saying them out loud, people did not conform as often. So think about this. If all of your Confederates out loud say the wrong answer and then they ask you to write your answer down, you're not necessarily going to agree with the Confederates, maybe a little bit less, because you don't have to feel like you are maybe defying the other people in the group or disagreeing with them, right? Somehow it is easier to disagree on paper. And so we'll talk more about this in the coming weeks about group influences and how sometimes group influences are good and sometimes not so good. But one way to try to decrease these problems is to do something anonymously, right? So if we do an anonymous vote, people feel like they can tell the truth perhaps if they write it down, or if it's not as obvious what their opinion is, they don't have to go along with the crowd. So conformity dropped dramatically, and I have seen this myself in times when I've done this activity in class. I've had people say their answers out loud versus having them write them down, and I typically find that when I let them write them down, most people, although not all people, but most people will say those 3 lines are the same length, right? So they won't conform. But it's just difficult to go against the group out loud in front of everyone. Okay? And if you have any questions about the material that we go over, please, let me know. So we talked about the importance of being accurate and how this influences our conformity last time. We said that with informational social influence, if we feel like it's very important for us to get the right answer and we feel like other people know better than us, then we will conform even more if it's a situation where we feel like we need to get the right answer. But we're talking about normative social influence here when we talk about the Ashes line study, where people genuinely don't think that the other people are right. And yet, even in those situations where people feel like it's important for them to get the right answer, they will still conform to a wrong answer. Not quite as much if they feel like it's not as important. But the idea here is that with normative social influence, you know what's going on is wrong and you go along with it anyway. Why would you do that if it was important for you to be correct? Well, because it's difficult to go against the group. Because perhaps we get reinforced for going along with the group and conforming, and sometimes we get punished or ostracized for going against the group. So it's important to keep in mind, though, that in these situations, bad decisions can be made when we're going along with the group blindly instead of thinking for ourselves. Okay? Conformity can occur even when the group is wrong, even when the answer is obvious, and even when there are strong incentives to be accurate. That is so crazy, right? Think about this. We are conforming to other people sometimes, even when it is obvious that we know the correct answer and everyone else is giving the wrong answer. With the Ash's line study, it's a really easy task. In fact, people got it right almost 100% of the time when they were by themselves. So then why would they conform on an easy task with an obvious correct answer, and even if it's important not to make a mistake or not to get the wrong answer? Perhaps it's because people find it difficult to risk social disapproval even by strangers. That whatever the punishment will be for having the wrong answer, we don't feel like that punishment is as strong as the punishment that we get from upsetting other people. And perhaps this is something that's ingrained in us by society. Perhaps it's just part of nature, part of wanting to belong to the group, and that belonging to the group is an important part of survival. And we'll talk more about groups next week. But it is very difficult for us to risk disappointing people, even if they're strangers. Most people are very polite to other people, even if they're strangers, or we get upset if we feel like we've upset someone else, even if we don't know them, we're never going to see them again. We really care what people think about us. And sometimes that's a good thing, but sometimes in this situation, it led people to make mistakes, like they're giving the wrong answer just because everyone else was as well. So when we talk about normative social influence, we're talking about going along with other people just because we want to fit in. One example that you might think about a lot, and that some of you talked about in your activity last week, would be fads, right? Now, I don't consider myself a terribly fashionable individual. I have 2 kids, and if I'm not at work, I'm in my sweatpants, okay? But some people keep up with fads more than others. We have maybe perhaps celebrities that people try to dress like them or do their hair or their makeup like them or whatever the case may be. And fads change over time, right? So something that's popular now might go away and come back. And often when I talk in class about this, I have people give the example of Crocs. I'm sure you guys probably remember Crocs. They were a very large fad a while back. It seemed like everybody had Crocs, and they made all kinds of knockoff Crocs that were not quite as expensive, right? It says now, and these slides are from a few years ago, but at the time of these slides, it says that an anti-Croc page on Facebook currently has 1.6 million fans. So I guess we have mixed reviews about Crocs. But the idea is whatever the big fashion craze is, people feel like they have to have it. Maybe you didn't like Crocs, or whatever the case may be, whatever the fad is. Maybe you don't like what everybody else is wearing, but you feel like you have to have it too because you want to fit in. Now, we probably think about this happening in like junior high or high school, but I don't think it ever stops happening. I think we pretty frequently want to have the car that everybody else drives or the cell phone that everybody else has. We want to be like everyone else. Even though we're in an individualistic society, conformity still plays an important role in our everyday lives. And we're talking about something like fashion, that's relatively trivial, right? However, there are some examples that are much more serious, and one would be body image. So when we're talking about body image, we're talking about what we are taught by society as the norm for attractiveness, right? It says current Western American culture values extreme thinness in women. So this is maybe changing a little bit, but think about perhaps the models that you see modeling clothes, or the people that are on the covers of magazines, or the actresses that play in the movies, right? Typically you see extremely thin individuals, right? Now this is not a cultural universal. In other cultures, actually plumper, more curvy figures are preferred. And this has changed over time, right? So in our country, over the years, this goes back and forth, and so it changes a little bit. But this is a very serious example because people are perhaps developing eating disorders and depression and anxiety and not liking themselves, all because of what society is telling us we are supposed to look like. And in most cases, these individuals that we're looking at, they're photoshopped, or they're rich enough to have a private trainer and a chef and all of that most of us don't have. And so we're setting ourselves up for failure by trying to be something that is not realistic and not what it seems like. But this is a very dangerous, very serious issue, right? Think about Barbie. Now, I have heard that they've recently started coming out with the different Barbies that have different body styles and taller and shorter and that kind of thing. But in the past, Barbie has kind of been considered the standard for beauty or whatever, the body style. And very few women actually conform to that or actually fit into that category. And so I do worry about what we're telling our daughters that they're supposed to look like, what we're telling women in our culture to look like. It can certainly become a dangerous situation. And I remember having a student tell me about an individual who had gotten extreme plastic surgery because she wanted to look like a Barbie, right? So sometimes we become obsessed with this, and it can cause a lot of problems. But when we're talking about whatever the cultural, social norm is for attractiveness, it varies a lot from culture to culture, and it seems to have a lot to do with the food supply. It says, as the reliability of the food supply increases, the preference for heavy to moderate body sizes decreases. Basically, what this is saying is that in cultures like ours, where for the majority of people food is readily available, we see the idea of success or attractiveness as a thinner figure. But in other cultures, when they don't have as much food, then having a fuller figure is seen as a sign of success, right? That these individuals are rich, they have money, they have resources, they have access to food, and that's seen as a sign of success. So in our culture, things are different just because of the way that we're set up in the food supply. And so in our culture, we tend to see it this way, but this has changed over time and will probably continue to change. But we are setting up standards here that could potentially be dangerous, and that's something that we have to keep in mind. So when we're talking about body image, this can be both informational and normative social influence. The informational social influence, as you remember, is the idea that other people know better than us. And so we're going to conform to them because we think they're right? So perhaps, who do you think is an expert on attractiveness or on beauty? And maybe you think models or celebrities and the people on television who are maybe the makeup artists and they're designing these clothes. You see those individuals as experts. And so you conform to what they seem to believe is the idea of ideal attractiveness, right? So we believe that other people know better than us, right? And it's not just necessarily the media, but also family and friends, right? The messages that we receive from our parents and from people around us play a large role in how we see ourselves. But the informational social influence side is that we actually believe other people are experts on the subject, and so we just agree with what they seem to believe, right? And then, of course, the normative social influence side is just that we want to fit in, and so we want to do whatever is popular at the time. Now, lest I leave you guys out, men also have body image issues. It says the cultural norms for men's bodies have also changed over time. So currently, the ideal male body is more muscular, right? And that's what we say is valuable in our culture. So there is also pressure on men. So when I talked about women, I talked about things like a Barbie doll, but there are also toys that are designed for boys. Like, look at any superhero or wrestler or any toy that you pick up for a boy, right? My son is 5, and he's recently made a switch to dinosaur toys. But in the past, he's really liked superheroes. We have a large collection of superheroes, and they all have like 18 abs, which is terribly unrealistic. I mean, if you read the comic books or if you watch the movies or whatever, Peter Parker is not supposed to be ripped like that. But we'd make that way in the dolls. So we are putting pressure on men as well. Maybe it's that women are more sensitized to it, or maybe it's just that it's easier for women to talk about it than it is for men, but it's still an issue, right? Like, for example, you see an example of this doll here. It says that the waist, chest, and biceps of the popular toys have changed over the last few decades, right? And this will probably continue to change. But children may not understand. They may not have internalized these things yet, and then we give them these kinds of toys to play with, and it gives them ideas, right? So I know that most people play with dolls and toys like this and they're not harmed by it. But you can see how we're priming people. And think about the Disney movies, right? What does a Disney princess look like? very, very thin, kind of hourglass-ish figure, large eyes, small nose, small mouth, right? Beautiful, obviously, although if that proportion was put on a real person, it would probably look strange with the giant eyes and everything. But when we're talking about Disney, why do they design all of their princesses like that? Is that what we're telling girls is the ideal body type? It's just something to keep in mind, although something we don't necessarily think about a whole lot. Okay? So we're talking about normative social influence, about conforming to other people because we want to fit in. So when will we give in to this? Because obviously we don't give in all the time. When will we conform? Well, social impact theory gives us some ideas about things that make us more likely to conform. And so on the coming slides, we're going to talk about each one of these. But first of all, strength, it says the importance of the group to the person. So as you'll see, if it's a group that you really want to fit in with, then you'll be more likely to conform to them. Immediacy, do you spend a lot of time with them? Do you share space with them? Like, are they in the same house with you? Or are they at the same school with you? Or at your workplace, right? And the number of people in the group, which you'll see there's actually an interesting spin on the number of the people in the group that you'll see. So it says, more conformity to normative pressures from the group is, first of all, more important. You can see why this would be true, I think. If we really care about being a part of the group, then we may be afraid to go against the group. We're afraid we might lose our group membership. So more conformity when it's an important group, like maybe, for example, your family, right? Everyone wants to get along with their family. Maybe your friend group, you want to go along because you want to be friends with them, you want to be part of that group. Maybe your coworkers, you want to get along with your coworkers, right? Or people in your sorority or your fraternity or your team, if you're on a sports team or anything. If the group is important to you, you'll conform. If the group's not important to you, you don't mind losing your position in the group, then you'll be less likely to conform, okay? Also, more immediate, so the more time that you spend with these people, because be careful who you spend time with. They really will start to rub off on you. And so the more time you spend with them, the more likely you are to conform. However, number and group size operates differently. So you might think that a larger group would cause more conformity than a smaller group. It says conformity increases as the number of people in the group increases to a point, right? So up until about 4 or 5. So what this is saying is that a group of 5 people is going to be more influential than a group of 3 people. And a group of 4 people will be more influential than 1 or 2 people, right? But when you reach 4 or 5, it doesn't become much more difficult to resist conformity as the group gets larger. So a group of about 5 is just about as influential as a group of 15. It doesn't get a whole lot more. And there are some possible reasons for this, but one reason that I think of here is that if it's a larger group, perhaps it's more likely that you won't be the only person who doesn't want to go along with this. So if the group is doing something that you feel like is wrong, if there's 5 people, they might all want to go along with it. But in a group of 15 people, there'll probably be at least 1 or 2 people who agree with you that they don't want to do it. So it doesn't necessarily continue to be more difficult with very large groups. Also, maybe perhaps with larger groups, you haven't had a chance to interact with each person as much if it's a very large group. We'll talk more about groups next week. But whatever the case may be, as the group gets larger, it doesn't really get more difficult to resist conformity after about 4 or 5. Okay. It says normative pressures are much stronger when there's a cost to losing the group. So if we lose someone that we care about, or we feel like we lose a relationship that we care about, that's difficult. But sometimes it goes even beyond that. Maybe you lose your job. Like, you would have to think about at what point would you refuse to conform if you knew that it could cost you your job, if it could cost you something very important to you, right? Sometimes in the past, there have been people who have been threatened even with their lives for not conforming. So obviously, the more pressure there is, the more likely you are to give in. It also says here that highly cohesive groups can make less logical decisions. So when we're talking about a group being cohesive, what we really mean is that all the people there want to be there. They all are very like-minded. And we'll talk more about groups, as I've said. Next week, we'll talk about why groups often are cohesive. But typically with a group, they operate in a way to make you cohesive. They want, in a large group, typically, they want everyone on the same page. They want everyone to feel the same way about something. And so if it's a very cohesive group, then everyone is going to be very worried about losing their position in the group or upsetting the other people. So they may go along with the decision that they don't think is right. They may be more likely to conform, even potentially in a situation where they really don't want to, because they feel like it would be a problem for them to upset someone else in the group. So what happens, though, if you have an ally in the group? It says, a variation on the original Ash study, 6 of the 7 Confederates selected the incorrect line instead of unanimous. So what happened here was they replicated the Ash's line study that we talked about, and they had 6 Confederates give the wrong answer, but they had 1 Confederate give the right answer. So in this situation, you had an ally. Even if it was only one other person who agreed with you, you would still be significantly less likely to conform. Even if it's only one, maybe there's 9 people sitting here and only one of them agrees with you, but it doesn't matter. That's enough. If you have one ally, it feels safer to disagree with the group as long as you have somebody who's on your side, right? So conformity dropped. It didn't completely go away, but it dropped to 6% versus 32% before. So people are much less likely to conform if they have at least one other person that agrees with them, right? And I think that's because having another person means it validates our point of view, that we're not the only person that feels this way. And it also makes us feel like even if we were to lose everyone else in the group, we still have at least this one person, so we haven't lost everything. Okay? So when we're talking about having allies in the group and talking about making decisions, one example that's talked about a lot in social psychology is looking at the government, and so perhaps the Supreme Court. Now, you know that we had a Supreme Court justice pass away recently, and so at the moment we only have 8 Supreme Court justices. Typically, we have 9, and the reason is that you would want to have an odd number so that you couldn't have a tie, right? And so that can be an issue right now. Having 8 justices means that we could have a tie, and then we'd have to figure out how to resolve that. But typically, when you have 9 justices, which is as they expect it to be most of the time, the most common decision ratio is unanimous 9-0. So the idea here is that every single person agrees most often. Not always, but most often. So the most common decision is unanimous. The least common decision ratio is 8-1. It is very rare and difficult to be the one person who disagrees. Typically, if you don't have any allies at all, then you'll go along with the other people in the group, right? Now, we can understand how this could be dangerous. Think about something like the government, or maybe something like a jury, if you've ever served on a jury or you know anything about it. Perhaps every other person on the jury thinks that the person is guilty, but you think they're innocent, right? If you go along with what they're saying, there is the potential that this individual who is innocent could go to jail, right? So it is very, very difficult to be the lone dissenter here. In other words, to be the only person who disagrees with the group. But it can be important to stick to your guns if you really feel like it's the right answer. Okay. The group's culture also plays an important role. We've talked about this before, and we've said that our culture is individualistic. So we tend to look out for ourselves. We tend to focus more on ourselves and our own individual achievement, whereas a collectivist culture would focus more on group membership. So this might not be surprising. You actually see greater conformity in collectivist cultures. So when they replicate the Ash's line study in collectivist cultures, they find a lot more conformity. And this is just because when you've been raised to be part of a group and you've been taught to be respectful of everyone, then you're less likely to verbally disagree with that person, right? Your group membership, you may probably stand more to lose if you feel like your group memberships are very important. So we've been talking about things like conforming in simple psychological experiments or studies, but sometimes conformity can be really, really dangerous, right? It says the dark side of social influence, like, for example, propaganda. Systematic attempts to manipulate the thoughts and the behaviors of others. So sometimes people think about something like Nazi Germany here. We can look back on that horrible time in our history and we can think, how could anyone go along with that? How could anyone agree with the kinds of things that were being done? But you have to think about the situation for those individuals. If people are conforming and saying the answer is obviously wrong, they'll give that answer out loud in a psychological study, that doesn't necessarily mean that only happens in the lab. It happens in real life. It happens every day. And so for these individuals, they were in a difficult position where, on the one hand, it's both informational and normative social influence. So with informational social influence, the leaders of the country fed them inaccurate information, and it was propaganda. It wasn't true, but they fed them information. We think that we can trust our leaders. We expect that they have our best interest at heart. And so sometimes we can be fooled by someone who is maybe a very charismatic leader. You might think about the Jonestown incident where all the individuals were led to a mass suicide, and it was horribly traumatic, but it was because they were following their leader who was very charismatic, and they thought that he knew more than they did. So informational social influence can lead to this kind of tragedy. But also normative social influence, because when we're thinking about something like Nazi Germany, individuals who were standing against Hitler were likely to be rejected, to be ostracized, and that is on the less serious end of the things that could happen, right? If you are in a dictator society, then perhaps you could be killed yourself for not going along with it. So obviously, very difficult situation. So why do we study history? We study history so that we can try not to repeat it. And so we need to think about how these things work and pay attention to this and make sure that it doesn't sneak up on us again, because some really, really terrible negative things have happened in our history because of people conforming when they shouldn't. However, I don't want to make it sound like conformity is always a bad thing. I think I mentioned this maybe perhaps last week, but sometimes conformity is a good thing. We said that a social norm is just a rule that society considers acceptable, right? So sometimes we can use conformity in a good thing, right? Maybe, perhaps, if all of your friends are volunteering, you start volunteering too, even though you wouldn't have volunteered in the first place. Maybe all of your friends start exercising or start eating healthier foods. You conform to them because you think they know better or because you want to fit in, whatever the case may be. Sometimes, when other people are doing good things, conformity is good, right? Conforming to good things is good. But you have to be careful and make sure that you are thinking it through for yourself and make sure that it's a good thing, right? But you can use social norms to induce correct, socially approved behavior, getting people to behave better because of conformity. Okay? And then the last part of our lecture today is going to be about obedience. I know there's a lot of material today, so thank you guys for your attention. So obedience is related to conformity because when we're talking about obedience, we're talking about following the orders of an authority figure. We're conforming to what they tell us to do. Right? Now, obedience is a social norm. Think about what our society would be like if obedience was not a social norm, if children did not obey their parents, if we did not follow the law. There was a movie a while back, and I didn't care enough to watch it, but I did care enough to like Wikipedia to find out what happened. The Purge, maybe? Something like that. I don't know. The idea was that like for one night or one day, something, all crimes were okay. Like there was no law against anything during that like 24 hours, something like that. Anyway, I didn't see the movie, but I'm sure it was total chaos if you did see it, right? That we have these laws and these rules to protect ourselves and to protect society. And we do internalize this need to obey authority figures, right? It says, for example, sometimes you'll obey even if the authority figure isn't present. A few years back, I was working a job where I went into town at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and so obviously there's not a lot of traffic on the road, but there was this one particular stoplight that always, for whatever reason, just would not turn green for me, and one day I needed to turn left, and one morning I literally sat at this stoplight for like 15 minutes. I mean, there was nobody there. It just wouldn't turn green, and I just could not make myself go left on red. So I actually turned right on red and then went down to a gas station, turned around, and came back. I just couldn't run that light. I don't know why. I tend to internalize it, right? Thinking about like maybe perhaps even if the teacher's not in the room, we still don't cheat, right? Because we internalize that cheating is wrong, right? So we have this norm. This is not true for everyone, but in a lot of situations, obedience is so like ingrained in us that we will follow the law even if there's no one there to enforce it. Obedience is typically a good thing as long as what we're being told to do is a good thing, right? But sometimes, perhaps, people who are in authority give us orders that are not good, right? So it can have serious, tragic consequences. Perhaps if we're ordered to hurt or even kill other human beings. And if I asked you guys the question, what would you do if you were put in that situation? If someone who was an authority figure over you ordered you to hurt someone else, would you do it? And I imagine most of you are saying, no, I wouldn't do that, right? That's what we all think. But oftentimes, social psychology exists to show us that we don't always know what we would do in these situations. So we are going to talk about a very famous study called the Milgram study. Now, Milgram was a researcher that I believe this took place in maybe the 1950s, so it's been a little while. This is a very, very famous study in social psychology, and I do want to just say at the outset that this kind of research is not being done anymore. That's why we're still talking about research that was done so long ago, because this kind of thing is considered unethical today, and so it's not replicated. Okay, but I'm going to explain to you guys what happened in the Milgram studies. And someone told me that there's a movie. I haven't gotten to watch it yet, but maybe on Netflix there's some video about this. So it says, how many people do you think would continue to obey the experimenter and increase levels of shock until they had delivered the maximum amount, 450 volts? So let me set this up for you. Here's what happened. The individuals came in and they were told that they were going to be participants in this study. And they were randomly assigned and told, or at least told that they were randomly assigned, that they were going to be the teacher and another participant was going to be the learner. And the idea here is they told the people they were interested in studying the effects of punishment on learning. And so they wanted to know, if we are trying to teach someone something, if we punish them with an electric shock every time they get an answer wrong, will that actually improve their performance? So the participant thought that they were taking place in a study that was looking at the impact of punishment or pain on learning. So they showed the other participant being strapped into a chair and being hooked up to this electric shock machine. And they showed the person how they were going to be hooked up. Then they took the real participant into the other room. Okay. Now, what was actually happening was that the participant that was being hooked up to the machine was a Confederate. It was not a true participant. It was actually a researcher pretending to be a participant. So no one was actually shocked in this study. But the participant who was taking part of the study, they went into the other room, they were shown the control panel, and they said, okay, now you're going to ask them questions through this radio, and every time they get a question wrong, you were to deliver a shock. Now, the first shock was a very mild shock, very low, but every time they got a question wrong, they increased the voltage, right? All the way up to the XXX skull and crossbones, deadly, dangerous 450 volts, right? So the question is, how many people are actually going to shock someone, a stranger, for getting a question wrong to the point that they would kill them? Surely we think this wouldn't happen, right? Now, I do want to emphasize that this was deception. The person thought they were delivering shocks, but they were not. They had recorded people screaming so that it would sound like they were giving people shocks, but as soon as they took the participant out of the room, the Confederate got out of the chair. No one was actually being shocked, so no one was physically harmed here. I'm going to email you guys a link this week to a video that will kind of show this, how this was set up as well. But how many people would go so far as to kill a stranger just because a psychological researcher asked them to? So you can see here, this is, first of all, they're showing the accomplice or the Confederate being strapped in. So the true participant thought that this individual was being shocked. Okay. This was the control panel, so you can see that you start down on this end where it's a very mild shock, and then every time they get a question wrong, you would increase the voltage all the way up to a deadly dose, right? So how many people would go all the way? When they asked people about this, the majority of people estimated about 1% of the population. So if you bring in 100 people, about one of them will go so far as killing someone else, right? Everybody else will walk away. They'll either say that they wouldn't participate at all, or they would say that they would, do it for a couple of times, and then as soon as the other person was saying, I'm hurt, then they would stop. But they said about 1% of the people will go all the way. There's just always one in a crowd that would do it. This was psychology majors, middle-class adults, psychiatrists. Everyone said, yeah, about 1% of the population may be seriously mentally ill, so they would go all the way. Most people would not. So here is a link to a video that I will email you guys so you can watch it if you want to. This video shows something similar being replicated today. Now, as I told you guys, they can't replicate this research because it's unethical, but this individual found a loophole. The people here were being part of some kind of television show, and so they had signed a waiver saying, you can do whatever you want to me, and they had agreed to that. So because of that, they were able to do something similar to this study. But in most psychological research studies, they're not going to let you do this. The IRB is looking out for you to make sure that they don't do this kind of thing. So as long as you guys don't sign up to be on a television reality TV show, you should be okay, right? And you can see why this kind of research would be unethical. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So the average maximum shock delivered was 360 volts. Remember that 450 was deadly. The average person went all the way up to 360, but 62.5% of participants delivered the 450 volt shock. Let that soak in for a minute. 62.5% of people did a level of electric shock that would be deadly to a stranger for answering memory questions wrong. That just seems like how that's impossible, right? How could this happen? And the researcher who was in the room with them encouraged them to continue doing the study, but they didn't actually force them to. No one physically said, you have to stay in this room, I'm not going to let you leave. They encouraged the person. If they said they wanted to leave, they said, well, you said you would do this, experiment requires you to continue, but no one actually forced anyone to stay. 62% of people killed someone because they were obeying an authority figure. 80% of participants continued giving the shocks even after the learner cried out in pain and said his heart was bothering him. So this person might have been screaming into the radio like, I have a heart condition, you're going to kill me, I'm having a heart attack, I'm dying. People continued to give the electric shock. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, I would never do that, right? But these are just average people off the street. I mean, these are not serial killers that they brought in here. This is just the typical person. How could this happen? How could so many people hurt people? And what does this tell us about human nature? I'll leave that for the activity this week. Why would someone do this? Well, it's normative social influence, right? They felt like they were going along with something, even if they disagreed with it, because they wanted to fit in with the experimenter. They didn't want to disappoint the experimenter. They thought of this person as a legitimate expert authority figure, and they didn't want to let that person down, right? And also, as I said, the experimenter was insistent. They never actually forced the people to stay, but they did say, you said you would do this, you agreed to be part of the study. So they made it difficult to say no. Not impossible, but difficult, right? It says variations on the original study. Other teachers refused to continue. So you had other people who said, you know what, this is not okay, I'm leaving. And a lot of people agreed and left with them. Remember what I said a few minutes ago about how if you have an ally, even just one other person that agrees with you, it's easier for you to resist conforming. So if they had one other person that said, you know what, I'm not going to do this, you were less likely to do it as well. But still, there were so many people that did this that basically would have killed someone if anyone had actually physically been hurt. Now let's think about for a second the ethics to this study. Is this study ethical? No one was physically harmed. No one was shocked. And after the study was over, they debriefed people and told them what had happened. But imagine the psychological damage to the individuals to have just gone through this where they thought they killed someone and they found out that they had the potential to kill a stranger just because an authority figure told them to. I mean, that causes a lot of psychological damage to the participants. And that's why this kind of thing is not done anymore, right? It's not replicated anymore. Imagine what a confusing situation this is for people. You have, on the one hand, we are taught to obey authority figures, right? This individual was a PhD professor. They were probably wearing a white lab coat. They looked like they were professional. And we're told to go along with those people. On the other hand, though, we're taught not to hurt other people. We're taught to be kind and to care. And so in this situation, we have competing social norms. We don't know what to do, right? But in that situation, the person we were shocking, supposedly, no one was getting shocked, but the person we are shocking is in the other room, whereas the experimenter is in the room with us, and that makes it hard. It says the experimenter is an expert, so we looked at the experimenter and said, they know what they're doing. If this was actually harmful, they wouldn't be telling me to do this, right? This has been approved by someone, so we expect that they know what they're doing, and so we're more likely to go along with them, right? We see them as an expert. It says variations on the original study. If a non-expert gave the instructions, people didn't shock as much. So if we had maybe someone who came in and said, well, I'm just an undergrad student, but they told me to tell you to do this, people were not as likely to conform. Because it wasn't an expert, they said, well, you don't know what you're doing, I'm not going to do this, right? Also, if two experts disagreed about continuing, all the participants stopped. In this situation, you have an expert ally. So you have one of the experts saying that they don't think this is right. Almost everyone would go and say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore if that situation happened, if you had an ally who was an expert. So as I've said, this was a terribly unethical study. However, it tells us something really important. And, you know, we can't do this research anymore, but it does tell us something about human nature. Which leads me to activity 8 for this week. So for activity 8, I want you to talk about Milgram's experiment. Give me a little bit of information so that I know that you understood what happened. And then tell me, if you were the participant, what would you do? Maybe you would drop out and say, yeah, you wouldn't do it at all. Or maybe you would do it for a little bit and then stop as soon as they said they were hurting. Or maybe you would go all the way, right? Tell me what you think you would do. And tell me, why do you think people obeyed? Why would people go so far as to kill a stranger? And what does this tell us about human nature, right? Even though they weren't actually hurting someone else, they believed that they were. So why would you go along with an authority figure? And they did. I mean, so many of them did. Why would you go along with this authority figure? And does that tell us something about how important obedience is to us? Right? So I want your thoughts on this very famous classic social psychology experiment this week. So that is the end of lecture for today. I know that that was a lot of information, so thank you so much for your attention. So you do have an activity this week that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. If you have any questions, remember I have office hours. You can come by, email me, call me on my office phone during my office hours. I would love to hear from you guys. So if you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.